Okay, all right. So, sculpture. What did we do so far? We created a software instrument track, used sculpture as our instrument, and then I went to here and did tutorial 440 default for our bass sound generating patch here. All right, so like I was just starting out, instead of oscillators, these three objects are gonna do things. We'll get to those in just a second, but this whole upper section is kind of the sound generation slash timbre controls. So you're gonna have some sound. You're gonna be able to manipulate the material of the sound, and we'll talk about that. There's ways to make it ring more or less. There's ways to make what like simulated body resonance of the instrument will be. It will come straight through here, and it will jump to this envelope or volume amplification area. So here you have the normal ADSR part right here. We'll talk a little bit about pickup and spread, key spread and pickup spread. Output level, and we have a limiter in that section as well. Talk a little bit about that. It jumps up here to the wave shaper, which this is going to add harmonics and distortion and things like that. We'll talk about what that can do. It will then jump down to the filter, so that we know all about. So we'll just look at that briefly, but you pretty much know now this is a very similar filter than what we've had before. Then it jumps to what they call post-production, which is this area, the delay unit, which allow us to delay that signal that's coming through and do a few things with that, and then change it over time by using this little output grid. It goes below that amplification section to the body EQ, which then allows us to do things to the EQ of the sound as well, but don't confuse this with what you're going to see later in the envelope. Then we have modulation section where we have two LFOs, LFO1, LFO2, this thing called jitter, vibrato, which we're familiar with, velocity and note on random controls, and then I have the ability to assign two different controllers to different things. So all these things are going to be modulation. They're all going to work very similar, but they're going to allow me to control things with different stuff, like different controllers on my keyboard or different parameters within the synth itself. Then looking over here, this is where you can create your own modulation envelope, which this envelope will then also control different or modulate different factors in this upper section. And that can be either done through a, like we saw in ES2, like a point type structure where we say this happens at this point, this happens at this point, and then sustain is at a certain point, and then when I let go of the key, that happens from there, and I can change the time, and I can change all that, just like I did with ES2. But I can also record my envelope, and I can make that look and do whatever I want. And then to further complicate life, we have kind of that same idea here with the morph, you can call it a trigger or a morph pad or joystick or whatever. So I can do the same kind of thing with this. I can take the sounds over time and at each point create a state of being for all the settings in the synth. And then I can morph between those settings by time, or I can morph between those settings by actually moving them around and then recording the motion that I did. And then every time I hit the key, it will follow the motion of what I did. And that's where it gets just ridiculously crazy. So you have to kind of decide what am I doing, what is my goal in this sound that I'm going to be creating, and do I need all that complexity? Do I need over a 30-second time period to change my sound into all these different patterns? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Maybe there's an easier way with a really, really slow LFO, and maybe you're like, no, I want to have everything change in this synth over time. So it's just as complicated as you want to get. It has some pretty nice sound to it, but again, this is the last of the eMagic traditional synths that have been around in Logic for ages. And then next time we'll look at Alchemy, which is brand new and works in a very different way than what this does. Okay, so we are going to take a look at these objects, one thing that I want to look at here is I want to right click on this display area here and make sure that my string animation is in there, because if I play a sound, if it will play here, you'll see the animation of what's happening in that string area. That's going to be important. It's not the end of the world if you don't see it, but it's going to be important in kind of understanding what happens. So let's jump into these. We have object 1, which you can think of this display. This is how I like to think of it, is this is the string that I'm going to do something to. Pluck, hit, stroke, grab, drop something on. And I like to think of the ends as like the bridge and the nut of a guitar. Now, it's going to get away from that pretty quickly when you're not modeling that type of an instrument, but it helps me to think of why does the sound change as I move this object from center to the outer sides. And that shows me, like, that's kind of what happens when I play a string and I get closer to the neck, the nut, you know, the top part of the neck, or to the bottom part of the neck. It will change the timbre of that sound. And if I play in the middle, I get much more resonance. So that, you can think of that display as kind of being like that. All right, material. Let's go to that before we get too crazy with this object. I'm going to give it a little bit more strength just so I have a little bit more volume, and we'll come back to this. Question? No? Good. So the first thing I want to look at is this material right here, this ability to change this material, and I have two different parameters. I have what they call inner loss, and I have stiffness. And what it's doing is it's adjusting those parameters to mimic the type of material. So you can see it says nylon in the upper left-hand corner. It's very, has lots of loss, meaning it doesn't ring out, and its stiffness is maybe minimal at this point. Wood should have in our brains a stiffer material. Glass, stiff material, but should ring out longer, and it does. Notice the animation changes. So as I change that stiffness, the string becomes bigger visually, and as I change that inner loss, you'll see differences in how it resonates in that display. Not a lot with that one though. Glass, and then steel. So that's supposed to mimic those. I can decide on what I want from any point in there, and then what you're going to learn eventually is that with morph, I can move that around as I play to have it change, and I can modulate it, not just like with automation data, which I certainly can do, but I can modulate it with stuff. So it's not wrong to say, oh, I'm not going to use any of these modulation things because I can just automate that. Yeah, but it can do so much more rhythmically, especially by using some of these modulators to modulate that. So hopefully so far that makes a little bit of sense. All right, so we got the inner loss on the stiffness. All right, then we have buttons around this material slider. So let's do like something with a little bit of ring to it. And as I raise up my resolution, this is going to be the amount of harmonics in this sound. So depending on what my stiffness and material are, usually something more metallic is going to... There I'm going to hear differences in harmonics. Less harmonics actually sound less full, and more harmonics sound fuller, but I tend to think that you definitely kind of hear it as a reduced volume to it, but there's higher harmonics that are being presented, so it depends where I play. So that I'm able to change, and I'm able to obviously modulate any of these parameters as I get later in the synth. Media loss, that's over here. This also controls the amount of loss from the media of the string. So don't think of this as the body resonation. This is the resonance of the material of the string. So as I hit the key and let go, it's almost like you might want to think of it as an ADSR kind of function. Like it's not, but it does react that way. So as I have a low media loss, I'm not losing much, I'm resonating a lot. And as my media loss is higher, so now I'm getting very percussive, plucked, muted sounds. So I can do that. And then you can imagine as I change, I'm going to have different effects as I move those around. So that's media loss. Tension modulation. If you think about how tight a guitar string is when you play the string, you'll get a bit of initial detuning when you, depending on how hard you pluck that string. So it'll actually, it'll go off pitch depending on how hard it's plucked or how hard it's struck. I think guitar again is the easiest way to think about that. So if I get more loss here, or less loss, sorry. Now the display is going crazy. Let's pull that down a little bit. It's subtle, but there's a bit of small modulation in the string, and really that's what it is. It's really like an initial LFO with one cycle that's bending the string, or a quick pitch bend if you want to think about it that way, to just give us a little bit of, hey, I moved that string a little farther and it went off pitch for just a little bit, so I can control that. And obviously you can modulate that as well, because you can modulate anything. All right, that's the normal stuff. Notice on the bottom of this synth we have key scale. Key scale brings up all kinds of other stuff, and you can imagine key scale means as I play in a different part of the keyboard, it will scale these sounds in the way that I change them. So I have blue sliders and green sliders. So let's take a look here. As I play up or down that keyboard, which will be hard on here actually. Pretty resonant, but as if I go down, it can make it so that I have, now my lower notes are more muted, whereas if I go higher up on the keyboard, so it scales the amount of media loss between low and high positions on the keyboard. And the median key is C3, if you're wondering. So more media loss below C3. This is above C3, so if I put tons of media loss, you kind of have to, it's really hard to play on here. So as I get much lower on that keyboard physically, the media loss is higher and higher and higher. And that's that range of where it can be. So right now it's at a pretty small range with lots of media loss on both low and high. So I can change that to be whatever I want. We do that because a real instrument, a guitar, is going to have different resonance from a lower string on the fattest string than it will on the highest string. So this is all about physical modeling. It's all about trying to act like the real instrument. So we want that ability to change it. Now I can do the same thing with resolution. So this will affect the number of harmonics that are from lower to higher. And I can do tension modulation, which will also affect that little detuning from lower to higher, which you can imagine a thicker lower string is going to move away from its position more than a higher, tighter string at a higher position. So if that's something I want to mimic, even if my instrument doesn't sound anything like a guitar, but I want to mimic that physical playing on the guitar, and maybe I'm using a guitar controller and I want that to follow that kind of normal guitar behavior, that's where I'm going to change those. Now option clicking any of these will bring them back to where they need to be. So if you make lots and lots of mistakes, they will go away, and you can do that. Notice that when I click hide, they go away, but they are still being affected by those numbers. So if I change them and go, I don't like anything, and I click on hide, I'm still getting those effects. Make sense? Release is the same thing, where it will give me the ability to change it over the scale of the keyboard, but it is after I release the key. So after I release that key, what is going to be that loss as it varies from low to high string? So I already have this set to be really low. Let's do this. Notice they'll move together. I'm really, really low. So it resonates. I let go of the key. It has one media loss. Now I let go of the key. Has a much longer media loss, or less media loss, because now release is affecting that as I play in different parts of that keyboard. So I should hear different effects as I play lower. That release time is less. I hear less resonance on the lower part of the keyboard than on the higher part of the keyboard as I play through that. Does that make sense? Are you lost yet? Because we haven't really done anything. That's the craziness of this. This is just the material of this string. We're just happening to hear it using object 1 to do something to that string. And we're going to talk about the fact that there's pickups, and that's how we're hearing this sound. So, yeah, so we're going to get really complicated here really quick.
I just found that you can move the X and Y in that graph.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. As you, you mean for, yeah. Oh, yeah. You mean for the material?
Yeah, so you can, so in the low notes, it can be a different material than the high notes, and they'll go in between.
Oh, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. So you can move that as like a default starting point.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. All right, so let's just look at object number 1. This is this right here, the position on the string that this thing is doing to the string. Think of it that way. Right now we have it set for impulse. It's an impulse. You can think of an impulse as not like a pluck, but a movement of the string in some way. You're going to see in a second there's very specific ways we can make this string vibrate. The strength of it, of course, we can adjust the timbre of it, and we'll check out how that will. Let me get a little bit higher here. We'll see how that affects everything. Let me make sure I get these back off here. Okay, I think that's going to be all right. When in doubt, if you've changed a lot of stuff, go back and actually I'm going to change it to something else, and then I'm going to change it back to default. And it will give me that back because I didn't save it. So strength will give me more intensity. Velocity sensitivity, we know about that. How much does velocity sensitivity on the keyboard affect the strength of this object that's doing things to this string? And then I have this variation, which will allow me to independently, like velocity independence of different notes that I use for this string. We'll kind of come back to that because that one's a little bit weird. I'll talk about this gate in a second too. Now I want to show you impulse. These are the ways that I can strike or affect this string. So here's my strike. Gravity strike is like dropping something on the string. I can pick it, I can bow it wide, like with a much flatter, like if you've ever thought about string instruments. They can bow with less hair of the bow or more hair of the bow, so it can be flatter or wider. Noise, like kind of yelling into the string. People have done that on guitars where you yell into the pickups. You know, that's a sound. And blow, because we think of this as a physical modeling string instrument, but we can make like flute-ish type sounds as well. So it's a little hard to think about how you're blowing the string to make it work, but if you had super high intensity wind, it could do that. So I'm just going to choose gravity strike here. All right, so I can have this, let's see, what can I show you on here next? I can have it so that the key, each strike of the key affects the string. Let's see if I can do it with, mine's being weird. It's not registering on here. Ooh, there's a huge lag. Anyway, it can make it so that if it doesn't require a key note to do the strike, it can require a key note to do the strike. It can do a key release. So it's hard for you to see, but if I push down my key and then let go, that's when I'll get the strike.
Versus when you initially press it.
Yeah, so I hit it down, now I let go, now I get the strike. So maybe that's something, like maybe there's a delay to the sound that you want. And key on would obviously be doing it as I hit that. Let's see. Yeah, that's pretty good for object 1. Now, object 3 is very similar. Click them to turn them on, and here's object 3. So these objects, like we think of oscillators, could be at different points on the string, and so I could get different sounds at different times, or they could play at the exact same time. Now, it does have strength, it does have timbre, and it does have variation. It does have the gate with the key on and the key off, and always play regardless. But it has different types of how this string is struck at that point. It can be disturbed, something can bounce on it. It can be held like a bound. It could have a mass of something, or it could be dampened. So now you have to think about how these are played together. So as I play one with more strength than the other, and as I move them, because remember, I'm thinking the top, the right and the left are like the top and the bottom of the guitar, the neck and the bridge. No, yeah, the bridge. These sounds will sound different. And it's how those two are combining now when they both hit, at this point, they're both hitting the string at the same time. They can be made to hit the string at different times, so I get like a ba-da, ba-da, or bum, bum, with different times that I'm hitting that string. So it starts to get a little weird. Now object 2 can do both of what these can do. So object 2 can come in here and do all of these strikes from both object 1 and object 2. And what's really cool about object number 2 is I can use an external sound which I can side chain from another track in my, so it's almost like a vocoder. Now the external sound, it's weird to think about this, the external sound is hitting the string. So it's not like before where I said it was noise, like yelling into a pickup, but it's like the sound is literally used to excite the string, which there are, I guess there are guitars where you can do that acoustically, where you can run that sound into the guitar and it kind of vibrates the strings, and that's kind of the idea of what's happening there. Now, this is pretty complicated, and I'm not expecting you to be able to use all 3 objects and try to figure out how you're doing stuff, and then figure out where you want those objects to resonate from on the string. But you can see we're starting to get. So here's the blow, and I'm getting an odd sound from that. Now I change it. I could put their timbres very different, so they're kind of sounding detuned. I'm getting almost a delay or like a reverb from it. I have no reverb on this whatsoever. So it's position of the strings and what these objects are doing to the string. Let's take off 2 for a second and do, notice when they're on, the little orange thing is here. So let me make this back to, let me do this so I can get it back to my default. And I'm going to move 1 back here. I'm going to turn on 3, pull 2 out of the way. So 3 is bouncing. So literally like something hitting the string and vibrating on it. Now you have to think about physical modeling of strings. Yes, guitar, violins, mandolins, banjos, but also a piano is a string modulated or modeled instrument. So you're going to see effects for like hammering on the string, and that hammering is from like what a piano would do. The piano hits and then moves along and hits the string, and that felt piano hammer can have different sounds. Now, I'm going to show you one more thing, and then I'm going to complicate it like ridiculously. So let's look at this here. So here's, like I said, here's my objects. Now these are my pickups, and think of those just like on a guitar. I have 2 pickups, and wherever I position them is where they're going to pick stuff up. So if I position them right over top of the object, it's going to be louder, obviously. But if I position them away from the objects, it's going to be softer. Makes a lot of sense. The fact that there's 2 of them makes it twice as complicated, because now you're controlling 2 different amounts of volume for that sound without even getting into any volume level or any modulation whatsoever. Now here's another weird thing here. I can invert pickup B, which if you remember from digital audio at all, anything that's 180 degrees out of phase with itself or with a similar exact object, 2 sine waves 180 degrees out of phase are going to produce 0 sound. So if I it's producing a sound, but they're 180 degrees out of phase, I hear nothing. So you can kind of use inversion as a way to filter the sounds by phase inverting object 1 and 3. You're like, Austin's like, no! So it takes a while. It takes a while to kind of go, where does that need to be? Well, sometimes it's just, is the sound cool? You know, is my material cool? You know, you have to kind of decide what's the sound you're looking for. I don't necessarily expect you're going to master it, like go, no, my B pickup should be not inverted, but be about 30.36 away from my pickup A. You have to kind of just play around with it and look at presets and see how those work. Now, this is where we're going to get more complicated. If I go to Blackboard, and you can stay there, if I go to Blackboard and I look at excite tables, I said that when I changed a different way to excite the string, I still had these same parameters. Well, these parameters change, but not on the synth. These are in the manual that I put in Blackboard, but these are from the logic manual for the synthesizers. I can see there's some already are like, oh my God, oh my God. If I change to, say, on object 1, we're on object 1 and 2. If I change to, obviously, if I change to impulse, these are what they control. So strength controls impulse amplitude. So if I go back here and I'm on impulse and I do strength, let's make sure I'm back with all my normal default. There's my amplitude. Timbre controls width. Okay, let's make that louder. It's a little hard for us to hear in here because width is stereo or surround width of the sound. So it's almost like a stereo enhancer or a monoizer, if you want to think about it that way. Variation controls velocity dependence of width. So I'm not going to be able to do that here because I don't have velocity sensitivity, but this will change the velocity sensitivity for that stereo width. So I could make it where my soft sounds are mono sounding and my harder played sounds are more stereo sounding, which might actually be what happens on a regular instrument. So you have to look at these charts if you want to know what all these things do. So because 1 has these choices and because 2 contains the choices, contains the choices for both of them, 1 and 2 can use that same table. So I hope that doesn't make things too complicated or more complicated. Here is the, that's continuation of 2. Here are the excite tables for 2 and 3, because again, 3 has its own listing, and 2 has both the listings of 1 and 2. So they'll always work together with these. So you can see that they get pretty complicated, like disturb on 2 or 3 in the variation control controls the width, but negative values affect only a small section of the string. Positive values affect a broader section of the string. So you kind of have to decide, do I really want to get that far into this, or am I just, not really caring that I have this much control? And then I put excite table 3 on there for you to look at as well, even though those will be contained. I guess that's the continuation of this table here, because I didn't have them in both. Confused yet?
Probably. I just think it's kind of funny the sounds you can get out of it. I made something that sounds like somebody screaming.
It can go pretty far away from a stringed
Yeah.
instrument. Yeah. All right, so I can combine those objects in whatever way I want. I'm going to come back to my default because every time it makes just life simpler. And I said it goes here with the material through into ADSR. So we know what ADSR is, of course. How long does it take for the sound to start? Let's give it a little more strength here. Let's give it a little more volume too. So now I have my attack really short. Now I have my attack really long. We know what ADSR, what all that's about. Overall volume of the synth, and then it has this limiter in different modes so that it will limit the sound so that, like, Dustin can't overload his tracks. So mono will just, there's one limiter for the entire synth. Poly will limit each individual note that I play, which is kind of nice. And both, which is a little weird, will limit each individual note, but then as they combine, it will also limit them in mono, which could happen. You could limit both individual notes and then play a big chord, and it could overload the synth. So you can almost make it so it never overloads the synth. Now here is spread. When these controls on the object do not control the spread, you can control the spread here. So this is pickup spread, and you can see that pickup spread left and right. And as I move that pickup, then you'll hear it not so much in here. Let's do this, make this back down here. So you hear it moving within the speakers in the room, but what you also hear happening is when it goes past the other pickup and the other objects, you're getting like a phasing happening. Hear that like detuning? And it has a different effect, obviously, if it's inverted. Yeah, so it's not like a flange, but it's kind of like a chorus and a, maybe a phaser. So this section's pretty normal. Imagine that, something in here that's not complicated. Then we go to Wave Shaper. All these things you have to turn on. Now, Wave Shaper, like I said, is like a overdrive / add harmonics in different ways. This has a menu as well, from soft saturation to scream. And the amount.
I should just add a guy screaming over it.
Just like, ah, ah, ah.
No, just one continuous scream. So it's like, ah. Just like that. It's really great.
How'd you turn it on?
Click on the actual Wave Shaper.
I can't click on it.
I had that too. I went back and I redid the default because for some reason some changes that I made it unavailable that the Wave Shaper would come on, which was I couldn't figure out why, but it was doing that to me too.
Also, is this yours, Chris?
I gotta save this patch.
No, actually, but
I just found it on the ground. So it's
yeah, we just set it up there and we'll see if anybody comes in and wants to use that. Okay, so Okay, we'll come back to that. Actually, let's take a look at this right now. There is wave shaper variation knob settings as well, depending on the overdrive or distortion that I'm on. So when I'm on Scream, I have variation controls, bias alters the symmetry of the shaping curve. So these are very similar, these three, whereas Vari Drive is going to have its own set of stuff that happens. So like negative values reduces shaped signal and adds dry signal, whereas negative value in these others alters the symmetry. So how it distorts from, not necessarily from low to high, but the symmetry of the sound and the wave itself, of how the wave looks above and below the 0 line. So it gets pretty ridiculously complicated. But that's a nice overdrive. Not too complicated. Filter, don't have to do a whole lot with that because you understand filter by now. Oops, turn it on. Notice I don't hear any sound because now I turned on the filter and my cutoff frequency is too low. Now it's back to where it was because I'm on low pass. We have a high pass, a low pass, a peak, a band pass, and a notch, just like we did. I believe we had all those in ES2. Resonance, same thing. You're used to all that. So now I can do very additive, subtractive synth stuff with a filter, which is kind of interesting. So adding this filter into this mix now allows me to do some crazy things with that as well. Remember, anything can be modulated, and generally what you want to think of is anything that has orange in it will modulate easily as an object, as a target in one of these modulators down below. With me still? It's a little bit strange. I'm going to pull this back again and come back to my default. So we come through here. We have ADSR, we have volume, we have all that. We have the sound that I have. I'm going to give it more resonance here, give it more strength. I'm going to leave my wave shaper off. Delay. Obviously, I got to turn it on. Immediately.
Resonance in the ceiling.
Yeah.
People upstairs are like, what's happening?
I know. I have like mix level. So this is your wet level, obviously 0. No delay. So that's my dry wet mix. Feedback is the amount of delay or numbers of delay. You can overdrive this feedback. If you've ever done that, you know it will continue forever and go crazy. There. It will continue like forever. And then crossfeed, which is like taking the right speaker and the left speaker, if we use it in stereo, and feeding them back into each other. So these effects can start bouncing between the speakers and then combining and bouncing back and forth and back and forth. And you can have that go one direction or the other direction. Get a little bit more here. So it can jump back and forth and start re-adding back into the sound so you can get it to feedback even more. Sound crazy? I can change that speed and that groove at which I do it, which is going to come into account with this delay time. And I can modulate or automate this setting. So over time, I can change the speed of that delay or the time it takes between the delays. And I can sync it to patterns and sync it to like tempo markings.
Does it hold pitch or will it change?
It will change pitch as you move it. Like most delays will do that.
Yeah.
It'll get weird and go, but it was changing just before. It's kind of holding now. Input balance, more to the left or the right. So I can have a wet, dry level overall, but I can have a higher or lower dry to the left or right. So remember, this is just delay effects. This is nothing to do with the sound. Delay time, obviously here with sync, I have it synced again to the tempo of the track, but not synced, I have milliseconds. So I have a bit of crossover, so a crossfeed, so it's feeding back into the different channels. I think this will go 4 seconds. Which is crazy. Oh, I have some change of groove happening too. So if we do that, we should have it. There we go. Now it's single repeat, single feedback. Well, single every 4 seconds with the feedback is decreasing over time. But if we lower that down. Notice the animation only happens when the string is hit because the delay is in effect. It's a digital process. So same thing you could do by adding it through audio effects on the mixer channel, but it's within the synth itself and can sync maybe easier if you want to sync it to actual playback. You can go up to 2 bars, and that's dependent on tempo. If your tempo was one click in the temp, instead of 120, if it was 1, that 2 bars would be, 1 long, like 1 beat per minute. So you can get really, really crazy delay times, is the point. Delay off. Body EQ. Really just an EQ that's within the synth to shape the sound, a little bit different than the filter because now I can change them specifically with lows. Yes, you're going to recognize what these curves look like when you go in here. If I put it like this, that is more like a what? Yeah, or it's a shelf, but it's kind of like a high pass because it's kind of passing out all that stuff. But yeah, it's a shelf of frequency. Here I have more like a peak, and here I have the same as on the lows. So if I get rid of those, so I can adjust that. I have all these different body EQs. Now these, think of this as the EQ curve, like the EQ structure of the instrument itself, of the body of the instrument itself. So a Western guitar, if I choose that and I take these, that's going to be the physical look of the EQ of a Western guitar. Intensity here will allow me to change. I can also change things by going on the graph itself. Shift. So this has to deal with, remember we looked at vocoder and we talked about formant shift. Now there's not vowels produced, obviously because we're not using a voice, but this is formant shift of the EQ, of the transients or the peaks of this EQ curve. So I can adjust and manipulate those formants of that curve, and I can stretch them as well. So think of that as formant shift, formant stretch, just like you had in vocoder. And that will change the sound. And it can get really crazy because I can use like kalimba. And it's not making this sound like a kalimba. It's using the EQ pattern of what a general kalimba sound would have. If I map this sound and use these objects to have a more percussive sound, this will probably sound more normal. But you can use it to make it be just completely different. So you have to see how you're going to use that body EQ. Okay. Pretty crazy already. So string, what's that?
A little bit.
Little bit. So you have a string, you have 3 objects, you have 2 pickups, you have a material slider which you can change the amount of loss or resonance, you can add harmonics, you can then talk about the tension of the string and have a little detuning when you pluck or play that string. You can combine them in lots of different ways. You can affect their volume. You can change or overdrive them or distort them here. You can filter them like we have been doing. You can add a delay unit, and you can use a body EQ to change the overall physical EQ structure of the resonance of the body of that instrument. That's pretty intense, just all by itself. Now we have the normal stuff that we've had in other synths. Glide time between notes. Tuning, if for instance this is playing along with something that's a little out of tune, it's going to detune the whole instrument. Or if I want natural phasing or chorusing, I can put 2 instances of sculpture, and I could detune one low and detune one high, and I'll get a natural chorusing effect between those 2 tracks with the exact same content on them. Warmth, it's really just going to add a little bit more resonance to it. Transpose, I can transpose it up or down octaves if I'm not getting enough from the sounds that I'm creating here, or I'm playing on the keyboard and I'm not getting where I want it to be. Sometimes if your controller is very limited, the transpose will allow you to, so you have to keep jumping octaves, you can just change it there. This is very normal, keyboard mode. Number of voices, again, 16 allowed. Polyphonic mode, I can play multiple times. Multiple voices at the same time in polyphonic mode. I can mono mode, and then it's, and if I hold down the next note, I can get this pedaling effect where if I hold the original note, play a higher note, it will jump back down to the other note when I let go of the top note. Kind of sounds like Morse code. And legato will not re-strike the string as I play those notes. As long as I hold that note, if I hit individual strikes, it will re-strike the note, but if I hold it down, sometimes that's a desired effect. There's one pluck, but then the sound continues to run through the generation of the synth. So there is your sound generation area and your sound manipulation and your post-production. We'll look at a couple more things, and then we'll leave the rest of this to go for now. LFO. We know about LFOs. It's all pretty straightforward. I have rate. I can sync it so it can be to the beat, just like we've had before, or it can be free where it's in hertz. I can change the wave, so I have a couple of different more choices with different sample and hold abilities, and controlled by other instruments, so that's kind of cool. I can change the curve of the wave, so even though I have a sine wave, I can drastically change the way that sine wave looks with that curve function. We've had decay and delay before, where this will do the modulation after I let go of the key, or it will do the modulation as I hit the key. So as I select the target for that modulation, it will change that sound to either happen immediately when I hit the key, or to happen later after I let go of the key. Source right here for my rate of modulation I can do through here. I can come in here, and right now I don't have a lot of controllers and things because I don't have a keyboard plugged in, so I don't have like mod wheel and things like that. I can do velocity sensitivity, I can do key scale, I can do these controllers, but I don't have them, so I'm not going to be able to really do that anyway. So, target for that LFO. Here are all the different things that LFO can change. Pitch is obviously the most normal one that we're used to. If we put this back again to our normal sound, and wait, give me that, and give me that. And I have a rate to my LFO, and I have a sine wave, and I have some intensity, and I turn on my target, and I say I want pitch. So we're pretty much familiar with that. I can change via whatever, like mod wheel, and then I would have controls over how that mod wheel affects that LFO. All that stuff's very normal to what we've done before. The weird thing about this LFO, or the addition to this LFO, is I can have two targets to the same exact LFO. So if I wanted to sync this to, say, a quarter note, wrong way, and I wanted to affect pitch on one, I could do stiffness on the other. That's a parameter that's going to be up here. Then I could change the way those work together. Whereas now I'm starting to get a little bit more of a modulation, tension modulation with that happening. Two LFOs, both are the same, both can have two targets. So I could, on top of all this stuff, put two modulations and have four different things affected. It's like, oh my God, what the hell? When am I ever going to use all this stuff? I don't want to use any of this. I just want to have this. That's my sound. Everybody's song is going to be. It's a nice sound though. Jitter. So jitter is kind of the same thing. I can have a different set of modulation. There's my range. Notice it goes from into the audible sound range. So jitter on tape decks was like the warbliness that you would hear because the tape would move around on the head. So you can kind of think about it that way. It's really just another LFO, but it's also a FO. It's also a frequency oscillator because some of these are in the audible range. So it's gonna add to it, almost like FM. So again, I can have two targets per jitter modulator, and those are all those same targets, and it can have a rate and it can have an intensity, and those are independent of each other and independent of the LFOs. So even though I change them and go to something else, they're still going to work. To make things even crazier, so if I used all of these and my morph and my envelope, you're going to be like having some crazy sounds. Vibrato. Who can say what the difference is between vibrato and tremolo?
Vibrato's pitch, tremolo is amplitude.
Is amplitude, right? So if you see the violinist going, that's pitch, because they're changing the pitch to get that vibrato sound. And that tremolo, I guess for me, the easiest way to think of tremolo is the big old B3 organ horns that would go whoa, whoa, but it would be volume difference that you would hear. So this can do that pitch change, and the same kind of thing. We can modulate it with these different waves. We can have a different rate. Notice that rate's pretty slow because we want it to be low frequency, because we want it to be a pitch change that's not too weird and wacky. So let's make sure that these are off, and that is off. No targets, okay, and that is off, and oops. I'm always missing the amount for some reason. So there's my vibrato, and it can go at different speeds. You have these other things where you can do velocity of the keyboard or the controller can have modulation abilities, and of course it does the same thing. Two different targets, all the same targets, but now I can choose by the way those are done by the curve of the, kind of like a fade, or if we looked at linear fade and exponential fades, so it's going to give me different ways that the velocity itself can change it. And then I can do note on random as well, which is a little bit hard to explain without having a nicer keyboard to do. Obviously, again, same objects that I can, same targets that I can choose and change the intensity one way or the other. And then I can do settings for controller A and controller B that are outside the computer that are my controller itself. So I can assign those to different ones that I want on the keyboard that I'm using. Knobs, sliders, mod wheels, pitch bend, whatever I want. And then those can be done. So lots of modulation. I mean, all these different ways to modulate, and we only looked at this little section. Next time, we'll look at modulation with an envelope and modulation with the morph wheel that can set up those points so we can sync them and modulate them over periods of time, and even record, like I showed before, record movement of the morph wheel. Are you all sculpture experts now?
Probably.
So if we just look at some,
Yeah, my brain melted at that thought.
you can see this uses 3 objects. The pickups are pretty close. One object is nowhere near the pickups, so you would expect whatever happens with this, that it's not going to affect it very much. To know what these are affecting, I'd have to go back to those tables, because without these excite tables, I really don't know what all those sliders are going to affect. They're all on key on. It's more of a metallic than a hard surface. It has no wave shaping. It does have filter, but the cutoff is all the way up. We're on a high pass, sorry, so it's going to actually cut out quite a bit. It has delay on. It has a body EQ. This does have this envelope that's going to create some modulation, and it does have an LFO1. It has targets, 2 targets on jitter. It has vibrato with a rate, maybe an amount that's a little hard to see. That's not going to matter for me anyways. That's not going to matter for me either. So very different things happening when I hold onto the key, and that's what this is going to start doing. Taking it through a progression of modulation based on how long I hold onto the key. And what you're going to learn here is that this is the sustain portion, just like in ES2, and this last part will happen when I let go. So you can start to kind of get an idea of what things do. So look at here, this is one of the motion sequences. So it has a pattern if you watch this morph area. It's not playing its animation. There he goes. So each one of these states, each one of these dots is going to be a state of all this stuff. Not a big change really from what we hear in the sound. And now it sits at the sustain, which is going to be here. And then it has something that happens after that, which is going to be that repetitiveness. So you can kind of start to look at these and go, this one follows this. And it has looping on it. So it's looping from this point to that point, and it's looping forward. So it's repeating. So that's pretty crazy. I wanted to see what glitch was for Brian. I don't know if it would make it into one of your tunes or not.
Just throw a gross beat on it.
You can see this path through all these spots.
That is fantastic.
I want you to kind of think about how this works, and like I said, we'll dive more into this next week, because when we get to alchemy, it has that ability to do that really to a whole new level. So just to kind of give you a preview of that, to make life a little more interesting.
You can make surround sound alchemy.
What's that?
You can make a surround sound alchemy.
Yeah. Oh, I thought there was. That must be a limitation of this, because I think mine does.
Oh.
So now I can morph. I have the same kind of idea in alchemy where I can morph between things, but I can also morph this has like these infinite, complete other sound areas which have complete different settings and will change stuff as I go through them. So that, I point that out because it's not going to go away. It's going to be even more intense in alchemy. Questions? Are you like, ah?
A little bit.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
I don't think it's wrong to take some presets and to just go, I want a pad sound. I don't know how to get a pad sound. And, you know, I like that, but I don't really like the material. And that's enough for me to go, okay, you've at least gone in there and kind of made some changes. It's up to you how deep you want to get into this. There's no way that I could say to you, recreate this sound or make sure you do these three, you know, LFOs or these three modulation techniques. It's just going to get too overwhelming for you. Hopefully it interests you enough that if you see this in other synths that you use in other programs that you go, oh, I kind of get where that works now. I understand how that, and over time, then maybe you start to say, okay, I'm going to change this parameter and not just go and pick, you know, pre-made sounds all the time.
There's one problem with the presets, though. There's no steel drums.
That's not a problem. There is a, where is it here? Well, I think it's under mallet instruments. There's, where did I see it? Jamaican mallets. It's not very steel drummy.
No.
Uh,
You can't have steel's material and not have a steel drum.
not really.
That's what a steel drum sounds like, right?
No.
It's better than a real one.
Oh my gosh. I can't believe you just said that. I thought there was one that was morphing can drum. Maybe that's more like it.
Weird little pitch thing to it.
I know.
Yeah.
And that has that like not a re-trigger to it. I think that's because of the body EQ. It's probably got a lot of key change over key scaling over the instrument. Well, I guess not so much. I thought it would have a lot more. There is some. Wave Shaper's doing a lot of that too. So you just have to see how in depth you want to get to that. So I believe along with this stuff, you will see composing with sculpture. Same kind of idea, although I have to look at, let's go to our syllabus because I want to look at what I have. Because I want to give you time, but it's not necessarily to do like make your sounds and then, ooh, that's the wrong one. That's the other class. Synthesize.
Yes. Berries.
Come on. All right, so, come on. So we have on here week 11 because I want to give you time, but notice that I put in here studio time. If you would like to use, between this class and the sampling class, if you'd like to use some studio time to work in the control room, I'd be happy to show kind of how that works. If not, we'll start next week's class with sculpture, and then we'll look at those. We'll go into the studio and just look at the signal flow so you know how to get stuff back and make sure you can get logged in, because before you weren't able to log in, but I think you can now. The only thing you cannot do right now is use the board to control logic. It's going to come back as a stereo return just because of that internet situation. When the board is being controlled by the computer, the internet, it doesn't allow the internet to work. So I don't know if you can log in and access like the drives and still be able to use that. So we're still trying to test that out. So it gives you a couple of weeks to kind of work on that. It's again just another, see what you can create in sculpture. Get as crazy with it as you want to get with it, but you know, try to put some time in. for like working in there, like going in the control room and using a keyboard in there, or just like doing a mix in there, just hearing it on
okay.
speakers instead of just with headphones, and then kind of learning that signal flow of the board and being able to play stuff through there. I think it's just nicer to not have to use headphones to hear stuff.
Yeah.
It's so different when you start listening in there.
I want to test in some studio.
So that's what we're going to do next time. If you know that you want some time, I have a sheet that's in there. I think it's linked into the sample class, yeah. So I have that week's worth of times when I'm going to be around. So you could take any amount of times during those days that you want. I just want to know so that I can put you on the schedule so somebody else can see that it's taken.
Is next week then just a work week?
It is, but we're going to go through that little bit because originally I threw all this stuff out at the class, and then most people didn't do anything with the more for the envelope because it's just too crazy.
Gotcha.
So we'll start with that, and then we'll look at the studio and how it works, and then you'll have time to work.
Sick.
Okay? All right? Let's stop this.